A White Stone by Jim and Mary Corbett. Read by Kalvin Evans. Revelation 2:17. He who is able to hear, let him listen to and heed what the Spirit says to the assemblies. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat of the manna that is hidden, and I will give him a white stone, with a new name engraved on the stone, which no one knows or understands except he who receives it. From our Father's heart. How many people have seen my Son in your life? How many have chosen to serve me through my Son because they have seen him in you? How many have turned from their ways to my ways because of your ways? Does your neighbor know that you are my tabernacle? Does your enemy know that you are told to lay your life down for him and have agreed to do so? Do you know that I love the abortionist, the pornographer, the homosexual? Do you know that I have sent you to them that they might see my Son through you, so that they might accept him? Do you have the eternity of your every contact in mind when you address them? If not, why not? Chapter 1. Go out into the highways and hedges and urge and constrain them to yield and come in, so that my house may be filled. Luke 14:23. Behold, I am sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. Be wary and wise as serpents, and be innocent, harmless, guileless, and without falsity as doves. Do not be anxious about how or what you are to speak, for what you are to say will be given to you in that very hour and moment. Matthew 10:16 and 19. Okay, God, what in the world am I doing in a neighborhood like this? Tom Bracken silently asked as he walked along the neglected, decaying sidewalk, trying to remain in the lighted areas of his surroundings. I must have been nuts to come here all by myself. Tom had been told by his boss to determine the amount of damage that had been inflicted on the hospital, which was given to the firm to, quote, do with as they pleased, unquote. No one wanted it because it was located in an extremely dangerous neighborhood and because the building appeared far too antiquated to renovate, although it had been in moderate use until a recent bombing blew out the front door and some of the windows. Now that he saw the damage and overall condition of the building, he made up his mind to hand this job over to Jimmy, his apprentice, as soon as he got back to the office. The moment he stepped in the door, he knew he wanted no part of this project. In fact, he couldn't understand why his boss would even consider it in the first place. Almost fleeing the building, Tom traveled at a fast pace, as his assessment of the neighborhood barraged his thoughts. The pace and his constant vigilance sent him tripping over a small chunk of concrete, which had separated itself from the overused and abused sidewalk. A nearby rusty lamppost stopped this fall as he lunged and held it tightly until he could regain his footing. Boy, am I sure glad I don't live anywhere near this place, as he leaned against the post. He raised his leg across his knee to look at the scuff inflicted by the concrete. Wetting his finger and rubbing the damage to his shoe, he mumbled, wishing the post signs had allowed him to park closer. Traffic had been minimized in the area of the hospital since several bombings had taken place in a short period of time. Once I am out of here, I'm gone for good, he vowed in his heart as he zeroed in on the location of his car and hurried toward it. Tom's vehicle was now only 4 blocks away in a well-lit parking lot. He minimized his fear of being alone on the city streets in this kind of neighborhood as each step he took brought him closer to his destination, his getaway car. Once he made it around the corner, he would be able to see the lot. That thought made him feel a little better. Unfortunately, the darkened block right in front of him caused him to imagine that unthinkable peril lurked behind every bush, down every stairwell and in every yard, especially those that imprisoned vicious-sounding dogs that ran aggressively to the chain-link fence as he passed by. He found himself walking cautiously on the road near the curb just in case one of the fences broke loose as an agitated dog bounded against it, protecting its worthless domain. Forcing him to concentrate on the neighborhood architecture. What else would an architect do in this situation? He avoided escalating his state of mind from fear to panic. Tom marveled as he walked past houses long past their prime. They seemed like silent tombs staring at the dirtied street. Numb from years of neglect, their outward appearance seemed to indicate the dying inside of them. Totally unfamiliar with this kind of neighborhood and unaware of any potential for happiness or life of any kind behind the dingy, brown-stained shades, Tom was confused about his feelings. On the one hand, he hated what poverty had done to the people who were living there. Righteous indignation rose up within him. How could this happen? On the other hand, a compassion stronger than he had ever felt began to stir in his heart. Imagine the children, the broken, the hurting, who must live behind the peeled pane of every front door and eventually become a counterpart to the decaying exterior of every residence. Did year after year of bad decisions or bad luck or just plain bad everything bring the residents of the dilapidated structures to this point? He questioned. Was there ever a time when someone was able to lead this kind of life? Tom felt a different kind of sadness, one that embodied hopelessness and helplessness at the same time. This must be how some of these people feel all of the time. Then he noticed the little American flags on almost all the windows, symbolizing the owners' love for their country and the freedoms that they possess. Somehow those tiny flags transformed impersonal dwellings into homes with people very much alive in them, thinking, feeling people with dreams and hopes just like he had. How different can we be? Tom thought. Maybe someday I should take the time to really get to know someone who lives like this. Maybe. Reason put an end to those thoughts. Tom knew that a lot more than distance separated him from anyone who lived in this neighborhood. Passing a hedgerow of dried lilac bushes, Tom was startled as a young boy of 8 or 9 years of age ran into him while pursuing a basketball down the nearby driveway. In reflex action, Tom caught the ragged object and automatically flipped it back to its owner. "Nice ball," was all he could muster as the boy and his playing partner instantly overcame their surprise at his intrusion into their lives and spat foul words of disdain in his direction. "What you doing here, rich man?" They tried to intimidate Tom as he walked a little faster past them toward his mobile refuge. Much to his relief, the presence of 2 men sitting on a bench at the end of the block stopped the 2 boys from following him. Their helpless fish was off the hook, and by the looks of his clothes, a well-to-do one at that. As Tom neared the bench sitters, something rose up within his heart that took his mind off his fear. Both men were disabled. One had a leg missing, and the other had lost his right arm and shoulder. His face was visibly disfigured, too. Assuming that they had been hurt in some of the past terrorist activities or possibly in Vietnam, his heart of compassion reached out to them. He wanted to do something to help them. Maybe I could tell them about the love of Jesus. The thought took him by surprise, even though he did have his little pocket Bible with him, having gotten it into the habit of carrying it around ever since he became youth minister at his church. It was really more for show, a way of making a statement to the kids more than anything. He hadn't opened it for quite some time. In fact, he couldn't remember where it was in his briefcase. I'm sure these guys have no desire to hear about Jesus or anything else from someone like me, he rationalized. Anyway, it had been quite some time since he had last told anyone about Jesus. He slowed his pace long enough to deliver a simple, wordless acknowledgement and a half-hearted smile, and then continued quickly on his way. Tom didn't want to wait for the light to change at the intersection, but there was enough traffic to cause him to stop, stand, and pray like crazy. With his back to the 2 men, he could hear their jibes and laughter at his expense as seeming eternity of seconds passed. Just as he was about to step off the curb, one of the men stopped laughing long enough to address him. "Hey, stranger," the man called him. Tom turned around. "What you doing in this neighborhood?" he said with a knowing grin. "You a little out of place, aren't you?" he continued, giving his buddy a little elbow jab to show he was about to have some fun with this outsider. "But them are some pretty nice shoes," he said, looking at Tom's shiny maroon-colored penny loafers. Tom looked down for a moment at his very out-of-place shoes and and at the one-legged man. "I could use the right shoe," the legless man teased as he leaned forward on the bench. The man put his hand to his chin and furrowed his brow as if making a decision on whether or not he should buy the shoe. The comment made both men laugh uproariously. One of them laughed so aggressively that he began to choke, which loosed some phlegm from his throat and sent it flying right next to Tom's foot. "You must have some kind of story to tell us Po City folk," the second man spoke, becoming suddenly solemn. "So get on with it." Tom, startled at the seemingly open invitation and an opportunity to follow through on his thoughts of a little while ago, began telling them that he had just finished an inspection of the hospital down the street, and then somehow found himself flowing into a presentation of the gospel as the two men sat stupefied by the stark transition. For a time, they seemed mesmerized and simply stared and listened. As near as Tom could determine, they appeared to be held silent, almost captive by some unknown force. Then, as if released from unseen restraints, both men became visibly agitated, almost angry. "Look, we got no need for God or Jesus, or any of that religious stuff." "We got everything we need right here," the legless man reaffirmed. "Unless you give me your right shoe," he continued, looking into Tom's eyes with a dead serious intensity. "Yeah, or unless you got some extra money in them fine pockets," the other man said. Tom knew that it was time to go. These guys were interested in only one thing from him, and it wasn't Jesus. He knew that if he stayed any longer, they would find a way to get it, even in their impaired physical condition. He turned and walked across the road without saying anything. If he hadn't been frightened out of his wits by the blaring horn that erupted from the car that he had stepped in front of in his haste to get away, he would have been privy to some foul cursings from the two hapless men. When he did reach the other side of the road, he momentarily turned back in time to receive a physical, one-fingered salute statement of their displeasure. Actually, Tom was somewhat relieved that the men cut his story short. He still had several blocks to go, and the early evening light gave way to an eerie, darkened atmosphere. He couldn't wait to get inside his car. It was getting late now and growing frightfully darker by the minute. Shadows turned threatening, and somewhat unfamiliar became totally foreign. Tom began to walk even faster after glancing at his Rolex. Fear rose up in him. He had to consciously repress it, or it would easily turn to panic as he heard his own footsteps echoing on the pavement. Almost at jogging speed, Tom turned the corner to Beecher Street when something caught his eye. "Nice rags, man," Tom heard from one of the darker doorways. Tom stopped so fast he almost fell as his leather-soled shoes slipped against the concrete pavement. His eyes, wide with fear, focused on the figure emerging from the shadows. "Yeah. Hey, look at the Bible, man," came a second voice from the side of the building, referring to the small Bible that Tom had taken from his briefcase during his conversation with the two men on the bench. Now, how he wished he were still a few blocks away, even with them. The men had been watching Tom for some time, waiting for the right moment to approach him. In fact, they had targeted him the minute they saw his car pull into the parking lot earlier that day. They had considered making their move when he was on his way into the hospital, but decided that it would be easier and safer to do it later. The later, the better. All afternoon they plotted their strategy, even practicing their attack while waiting for him to emerge from the hospital's makeshift yet secured front door. In cat-like fashion, the three tracked him all the way back from the hospital, just waiting for the perfect time to act. Tom spun in reaction to the second voice, then turned back in the direction he had been heading. For an instant, he thought of running toward his car, which was now only 2 but seemingly 52 blocks away. "You a preacher man?" came a third voice that belonged to a steely-eyed person who moved in front of him, blocking the only escape. "Preacher man, you shouldn't be walking all alone in this part of town," he continued. "Yeah," the first voice said as he moved directly to Tom's right. "Someone might see those fine set of clothes and think you might have a lot of money or something," he continued. "Do you have a lot of money, preacher man?" the third man said as he pulled something from his pocket. Tom heard a definite click. The light from the lone street lamp danced off the shiny metal switchblade knife, and as it did, Tom's heart sank. He could actually feel the blood drain from his face, and he knew there was way more to this than money. As each man became more visible, it struck Tom that even though their faces and clothes were different, they all looked the same. Their baseball caps were all cocked at precisely the same angle, and their eyes, facial expressions, and movements all gave the situation the feel and appearance of a well-rehearsed play. It was as though, quote-unquote, tough had been practiced, and the next choreographed move could almost be anticipated. It seemed to him that the young men were actually reveling in making him afraid. He sensed that they aimed to draw out this event, giving them more time to instill fear into their prey. They were definitely experts. Consequently, a sense of fear, anxiety, dread, and helplessness greater than Tom had ever felt before swept over him. Unfortunately, an involuntary nervous smile formed on Tom's face. This only aggravated his captors. His initial assailant gave him a slap across the face in violent reaction to what looked like a smirk. The second grabbed him by the arm and spun him around, forcing him deeper into the shadows. Tom literally saw his life flash in front of his eyes as a third man, who now proudly displayed his knife, strutted toward him. The man in the shadows held Tom, twisting his arm behind him, and secured him by grabbing his hair and jerking his head back. As the man with the knife feathered the side of his neck with the blade, Tom experienced his warm, foul breath against his face and up his nostrils. Playtime was over. Gripping anger and hatred zeroed in on Tom as the man's face inched closer. "You think this is funny, preacher man?" the man said slowly. "You think you're going to live to tell your pretty wife about this? I think we need to show you how funny it's going to be to die slowly, right here, right now." The man pressed the edge of the knife to Tom's throat, poised to finish what he started. Tom held his breath. From our Father's heart. Do not worry, for I have my hand on you. You shall not lack. Do not look to the things that are said by man. My hand directs the stars. My voice commands the rivers to flow. They would stop if I desired it. My desire is for you to serve me. Nothing will stop that. Draw close. I notice the terrors of Satan that bluff and talk as if they know what they are saying. They do not know what I have in store other than what I have told them. You shall go forth, for I am your God. Not the God that can be changed by the whims of people, but the God that is moved by faith in me being able to perform what I promise. Have I not promised you? When will you realize the magnitude of my power? When will you begin to truly trust me? Seek me for me, not for what I can do for you, but for who I am as God. You have no idea what I have in store for you, but I am excited by what I see. I am pleased by my people who have said yes. When I am praised, all creation knows that I am God. Chapter 2. All whom my Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will most certainly not cast out. I will never, no, never reject one of them who comes to me. John 6:37. "Oh, Lord, help me!" Tom silently pleaded as he waited for the man to cut his throat. Off to his left, he could hear nervous, excited laughter and knew the one, quote-unquote, unoccupied aggressor was ecstatic over the prospect of taking a life. He encouraged the steely man gleefully. "Poke him a couple times for me before you finish him off." How could this be? All of his life, Tom had taken the safe path, a path with the least potential for harm or misfortune. But now, here he was, moments from death in the hands of three men on a dark street, men that simply seemed to want to vent their anger, frustration, and hopelessness on somebody, anybody. Years of emptiness, despair, and survival had taken its toll on these young lives, and the value of life had long ago lost its impact because of the hurt, pain, and sin that were part of their everyday existence. Now, to simply take what they wanted was not enough. They would get what they wanted anyway. There seemed to be a score to settle, and Tom was caught in their midst, helpless. "Is it the money you want?" was the only thing Tom could think of to say. "There's about $20 in my pocket. Take it. It's yours." "Oh, we'll take it," came the reply. "But first, maybe you should." Maybe he should what? Came a voice. Tom hoped that this actually was a rescue and not someone stealing prey from another, not willing to share the prize. Tom noticed that the street had become silent. The two men on the bench had disappeared. The sounds of doors and windows closing, even the distant barking of a dog, had ceased. So much was happening, so much to think. Unanswerable questions flooded Tom's mind. What should I do? How can I live through this? Is there anyone to help me? Is there anywhere to go? Time seemed to stand still, but Tom's mind raced on. He scanned all of his surroundings, looking for a way out, never even thinking what he would or could do if he found some way of escape. His legs wouldn't move. As a matter of fact, the only things he knew to be working in his body were his eyes, which were probably bulging and extremely wide, and his heart, which was beating so loudly he was sure the people behind closed doors could hear it. Train took about 5 steps away from Tom to position himself under the street lamp, which stood just outside of the shadows. Tom just stood and stared. Train reached into his outside jacket pocket with his left index finger and thumb and pulled a cigarette from the pack he kept there. With the same movement, his other hand produced a match, which he struck one hand and held the flame, lighting the cigarette. Tom watched as the man who had just rescued him leaned against a black steel lamppost. His size made the lamp sway, casting moving shadows against the pavement. For what seemed like an eternity, Train just stood against the lamppost, shoulders slumped, looking at the sidewalk. Finally, he looked at Tom. I'm Train. I'll be watching you. Been listening, too, he continued. You didn't see me 'cause I've been hiding. But I've been listening while you talked to them busted-up guys on the bench. I need to ask you some questions. I'll stand over here so you won't be so afraid. I'm not going to hurt you, he said quietly, much to Tom's relief. It was about then that Tom felt his heart re-enter his body. What do you need to know? He forced himself to say, his throat still hurting from the pressure of the knife. Train shifted his weight away from the lamppost, and with one fluid motion threw this burning cigarette on the concrete and moved back toward Tom, who instinctively stepped back a few feet. Train kept coming until he was only a foot away from Tom's face. An intensity shone in Train's eyes, the kind Tom had only seen in his son, Tommy, when he really needed an answer. Is it true? Train asked earnestly. Is it true about this guy you call Jesus, that he can take away hurt and forgive me no matter what I've done? Is it? The question startled Tom. Of all the things this man could have asked, this sure wasn't what Tom expected. Tom didn't know how to respond. He saw more pain in this man's eyes than he had ever seen before. The sincerity and pleading need to have it to be true almost overwhelmed Tom. Yes, it is, Tom said hesitantly, timidly clearing his voice again. It is one of the only absolute truths. Tom had no idea how he came up with that response. He also didn't know why his hand started to reach into the inner pocket of his suit coat. There he discovered his little Bible in the place he'd put it right after talking to the men on the bench. In an instant, Train's pleading expression changed to one of relief. He straightened for a moment and released a great sigh. As quickly as relief had come, his countenance changed once more to an expression best described as terror. He paced in front of Tom, his voice getting louder as he spoke. Why would he let them do that to him? He could have killed them all, couldn't he? Train again stopped directly in front of Tom, his piercing eyes demanding an answer. I heard you tell the men on the bench he was God. He could have killed them, and nobody would be able to put him in jail or nothing. But he let them hurt him, and he didn't even say nothing. Why did he do that? Because he loved you and me, Tom choked, remembering the response from a Sunday sermon. Tom grabbed the small brass snap on the leather cover of his Bible and shakily opened the unworn pages. For a moment his thoughts were paralyzed. Was John in the New or Old Testament? Oh, help me, Lord, Tom mumbled. Matthew, Luke, Acts, Romans. No, there it is. John 3:16. Tom's hands were shaking so badly he could hardly read the words. He had to bring the little book close to his face. See, it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Tom kept paging back and forth through his Bible as if looking for verses, never taking his eyes from the pages. And he talked, almost afraid to let the man in front of him say anything. He talked. He talked about the cross and love and God and whatever came to mind. What was it coming from? Tom felt like he was on a Bible knowledge autopilot. Bible verses he hadn't quoted or even read in many years were pouring from him. He wasn't reading them. He was just mouthing what was in his heart. For what must have been quite some time, Tom was used by the Lord to say what needed to be said. When Tom finally looked up, he could hardly believe what he was seeing. Tom was looking into the face of a man so much in pain that if he had known better, he would have thought Train had been stabbed in the chest. Train began to double over in agony, holding his stomach. Tom put his hand on Train's back as he let out a long, suppressed groan, releasing tears that he had never been able to release before. Tom kept his hands on Train's back while Train walked in a continual small circle on the sidewalk, still bent over, almost as if trying to escape the horrendous pain. "Nobody ain't never loved me," Train whimpered as memories of rejection and abandonment started to visibly rack his gigantic frame. "Nobody ain't never loved me like that." After several minutes, Train stood erect again, sobbing and wiping his tear-streaked face with his calloused, massive hand. He turned toward Tom. "I gotta do something to thank him for what he done. Can you tell him for me, preacher man? Can you tell him thanks for what he done?" Tom looked up at the most broken man he had ever seen. Without hesitation, Tom put his hand on Train's arm. Something unthinkable just a short time ago. "I think Jesus would like it very much if you tell him yourself, Train. I think he would be very pleased to have you talk to him." Shocked at the thought that God might listen to something he might say, Train stepped back a couple of steps in disbelief. Then he looked directly into Tom's eyes. Tom looked directly back into his, assuring him that it would be all right. "Do I gotta go to church or something?" Train questioned. "No," Tom smiled. "We could just sit here on the curb and you could just tell God what's on your heart." Tom started to move toward the curb to sit down when he noticed that Train had dropped into a kneeling position right where he'd been standing. Tom moved next to him, giving a quick look to see if anybody was watching. Train knelt silently for a long moment, his head bowed and his hands folded in front of him, resting loosely against his body. Quietly he began. "God?" He hesitated to wipe the tears from his eyes. "God, this is me, Train. I never talked to you before 'cause I've been afraid." The next few minutes was one of those rare instances of life when you have the privilege of seeing the God of the universe once again come to visit one of his chosen ones. Quietly, peacefully, almost too wondrous to relate in words. The work that was accomplished on the cross at Calvary 2,000 years ago once again became real and alive in one of his creations. A lifetime of the disease called sin was banished, never to return, as this mountain of a man was visited by the one who loved him most. Anger melted in the light of love. Rejection was washed in the love of acceptance. Loneliness was erased by the spirit of adoption as this lost, wayward lamb was gently led home to warmth and safety. Tom knelt in awe of the cold, hard pavement with Train as he watched his transformation from death to life take place. Cleansing after cleansing became evident as tides of tears flowed from a freed heart so long held captive. Silence, peace, hope, restoration, healing right there on the street which only moments before held fear, anger, and death threats. Oh, the wonder of God! Both men remained momentarily silent, following the most tender, loving communication Tom had ever heard anyone have with God. Tom stood to his feet and waited for Train to speak. What do I do now? Train said as he got up. How do I do what he wants me to do? You need to read his word. Believe what it says and live your life like Jesus did. Seemed to be the right thing to say. How do I do that? I ain't got no Bible. Train questioned. Take mine, Tom said, almost without thinking, extending the little book toward the massive man. I have other ones. Big hands reached to touch, then caress what he must have previously spit upon. Now, however, nothing seemed more dear as he held the Bible close to his expansive chest. It almost disappeared amidst the sheer size of his clasped hands. Thanks. I ain't never gonna lose this, Train said, wiping the last residue of tears from his face and straightening to his full height. He let out another long sigh of relief. A big smile revealing magnificent white teeth turned to a questioning, quizzical look as Train grabbed his stomach. Hey! He exclaimed, feeling different parts of his stomach as if looking for something. Hey! I don't hurt no more. Every day I hurt here, he said, pointing to the middle of his stomach. Now, I don't hurt no more. Train smiled again. I don't hurt no more. Darkness had now completed its cover, hiding the filth of the street for another day. Tom had lost all track of time, but then, time no longer seemed all that important. Tom noticed his knees beginning to weaken. In fact, he felt as if he were going to faint. The gravity of the encounter with the three men suddenly hit him like a brick wall. If Train hadn't intervened, he'd be dead. Those guys almost killed me, he said, remembering the edge of the knife and pointing to the spot where he had been held. Everything happened so fast with Train, and because his focus had been on answering the questions Train asked, Tom hadn't had time to think about what could have happened. Now that he had time to reflect, he felt queasy. He leaned against the building. You okay? Train asked. I don't know. Tom stayed staring at his hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. Knees buckling, Tom slumped against the building. As he did, Train knelt beside him, putting a comforting hand on his back, very much like his mother had often done when he was a little boy. Of course, her hand didn't cover as much territory as Train's. That your car over there? Train questioned, nodding his head in the direction of the parking lot where a lone BMW glistened under the lights. Without waiting for a response, Train easily lifted Tom to his feet, headed him toward the parking lot. Make sure you read that Bible, Tom said as they neared the car. You know I'm gonna, Train replied. Tom groped for his keys and then opened the locked door with his remote. Train handed him his briefcase, which he'd picked up off the sidewalk. In the commotion, Tom had forgotten he even had one. Train smiled, responding to Tom's surprise. I didn't take nothing, Train stated defensively as out of habit. Realizing that the statement was unnecessary, he raised his shoulders sheepishly. It's okay, Tom responded, trying to make him feel better. Tom hesitated with his hand on the door handle. I guess I don't have much to say right now. How can I ever thank you for what you've done? You saved my life. Train quietly put his head down. I think you saved mine, too, he said, tearing up again. Not knowing what else to do, Tom got into his car and started it. He sat and stared at the steering wheel for several moments and then slowly shifted into gear. Train backed away from the car a few steps. Tom gave a small wave as he pulled away. It seemed that there was little to say that could adequately complement the experiences that both men had just shared with each other. Tom glanced in his rear-view mirror at the man who meant more to him in the space of a few short minutes than anyone else would mean in a lifetime. Train stood quietly, following the car with his eyes as it pulled into the street. Tom saw him light a cigarette, turn, and walk slowly into the darkness. From our Father's heart. As the world grows darker, my people will shine brighter because of the love they have for me, each other, and their enemies. This love has already been established in the heavenlies and is about to be poured out in its fullness upon my people. Holy alliances will be made one with another. Kinsmen, friendships will be established that cannot be intruded upon by the vile jestings and coarse intrusions that are part of those who do not know me. I call you to separate yourselves, but in that separation, I am also calling you, my children, to come together. Some of you know the bond of adversity. Some know the bond of fleshly desire and adoration. Some know the safety of a kindred spirit. But no one has known the heavenly bond of the holy alliance that will knit my bride together for my work to be done, and for me to pour my love upon them. Establish it in your hearts now. Those I call to myself will know me and each other, with the love my Father and I have had from the beginning. Make no provision for the flesh in any relationships I bring your way. In my way, there's safety, power, freedom, and love. Chapter 3. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Days became weeks, which became months, after that fateful night of ultimate terror. Tom and his wife Sally constantly prayed for Train, even though she'd never met him and Tom couldn't find him. Because of the quickness of all that had happened that night, Tom never thought to leave his name or how he could be reached if Train had any questions. Often, Tom would find himself driving downtown to see if he might make contact. It must have been quite a contrast to the surrounding area, as a well-dressed man driving a new BMW couldn't stop anyone who looked like he or she might know a man named Train. It seemed that no one had seen or heard from him since that night. How could someone that big just disappear from the face of the earth? After about 6 months of fruitless searching, all previous events mixed into faded memories and somewhat tiresome stories. Sometimes, Tom would think of the incident and wonder if it wasn't all a dream, something he had conjured up. Sally and Tom settled back into the groove of their social, church, and family involvements. Tom's design work at the Henderson architectural firm, one of the most prestigious firms in the nation, was prospering. Several of his designs had been featured in Architecture Today, and he was fast becoming the rising star in the area. The Lord was prospering on all fronts. Tom and Sally had just completed the plans for their new home, which would be built in spring. They really didn't need a larger home, but since things were going so well, in spite of the war, they felt it was okay to move to Brittany Estates. They both had to undergo scrupulous interviews, financial reports, and social registration by the Subdivision Control Committee and were accepted. So why not? Sally, a successful fashion designer herself, felt it would be good for their professional image if they moved. And even though they only had Becky and Tommy, 4 extra bedrooms might someday come in handy. "There's a Mr. Horace Winslow to see you, Mr. Bracken," Tom's secretary, Connie, said over the intercom. On Monday mornings it was always hard to get started and organized, and this day was no exception. "Connie, I told you that I am in for no one," Tom responded. "I don't know a Horace Winslow. Tell him to leave his card and I'll call him in when I can." "If I want to," Tom thought as he turned his back on the infernal box that kept interrupting him. "Sure would be nice to be left alone." "Mr. Bracken, I think you'd better see this man," Connie said in a voice somewhat unusual even for her. He insists on it." "This better be good," Tom thought as he responded to her. "Okay, bring him in." Shortly thereafter, Connie came to the door. "I think maybe you better come out here and see this." "This Had better be really good, Tom muttered, throwing his drawing pencil on the desk. Connie, wide-eyed and looking a little like a lost puppy, followed Tom down the corridor to the main lobby just across from Mr. Henderson's private suite. As they neared the lobby, people were whispering to each other and heading in the same direction. The whole firm seemed to be focusing and congregating around some activity there. As Tom and Connie made their way through the people, they began to hear low, quiet talking, even what sounded like several people crying. Tom stood in amazement as there, in the middle of the lobby, were several people, including Mr. Henderson, praying to receive Jesus into their lives. Leading them was the 7-foot-tall giant of a man named Horace Winslow, known only to Tom as Train. Nothing like this had ever happened at the Henderson architectural firm before. In fact, the whole scene before Tom was almost surreal. Proud, stiff-necked business magnates and their wannabes simply wouldn't stop in the middle of their quote-unquote important day to even speak to the likes of Train, much less really listen to him. Tom shook his head and made a concerted effort to focus on his surroundings, to determine if what he was seeing was really happening. It seems that Train had walked into the lobby approximately 30 minutes earlier, followed by security guards who took notice of the giant, blue-jean, quote-unquote, hoodlum, as soon as he hit the lower lobby 10 floors below. From there, he seemed to gather people like a magnet. His size, dress, and demeanor all demanded attention in this traditional, almost stuffy atmosphere. As Train presented himself to Connie, followed by his pickup entourage, Mr. Henderson noticed the commotion and came to see what was going on. Then the miracle happened. Taking full advantage of the opportunity under the full anointing and the appointment of the Holy Spirit, Train began to tell all those who gathered around his very best friend, his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So simple was his presentation, so loving was his countenance, so refreshing was his wondrous truth, that the hardened, the cynical, the proud were pierced to the heart. Mr. Henderson, who hadn't even thought of God, if there was one, in 20 years, asked if Train would lead all those who had gathered to pray to the God Train loved so much. Those who turned their backs on receiving Jesus that morning knew that something wonderful had happened, even if they didn't understand it. It was obviously the power of the Holy Spirit at work in a way that Tom had never seen before. Precious, intimate moments of the people surrendering and turning their hearts toward home having passed. Train looked up and wiped the tears from his own eyes, grinning broadly. He looked directly at Tom and said, "Hi there, preacher man. I come to see ya." Tom just stared in disbelief. Finally, after standing there a while with his mouth open, he realized how ridiculous he must have looked. Extending his hand, he walked toward Train. When they got close enough, both men rejected the formality of a handshake and instead shared a big brotherly hug. The remembrance of probably the most significant event in either of their lives was simply too important to both of them. So they hugged, or more succinctly, Train picked Tom up, and Tom in return did what he could do to hang on while he was being squeezed. After Tom was put back on the floor, he began straightening his clothing to a round of applause. No one really knew why they were applauding. It just seemed like the right thing to do. Both men smiled, being somewhat embarrassed, so Tom motioned for Train to follow him back to his office. After closing the door, Tom directed him to have a seat. Train pulled a chair from Tom's conference table and straddled it backwards. "How did you find me?" Tom asked Train as he studied this man across the conference table in his office. "Your name was in this Bible you gave me," he said, holding up his now ragged-edged, love-worn friend. Then he placed it next to him, almost as if it had a life of its own and needed a response as any person would. "And your card here. You must have used it as a bookmark. When my Lord said I could, I came to thank you," he said with a smile that lit up the room that only moments earlier seemed cold and businesslike. "I don't need nothing. I just wanted to tell you what's happened to me since I met my Jesus last year." Through several unscheduled, seemingly unnecessary interruptions by Connie, Mr. Anderson, several secretaries offering coffee, and even some others Tom hadn't seen in months, Train settled in to unravel the mystery that surrounded his life for that last year. Before he could begin, Tom's intercom again invaded the room. "Mr. Bracken," Connie said, only to be interrupted by a harsh,
"Bracken, this is Hen—"
He quieted as if he were taken hold of by some new control in his life.
"I mean, Tom, this is Carlyle Henderson. Tom, it seems our new friend has caused quite a stir around here. Even people from down the hall, other offices from other floors, and our own staff would like to hear more about Train. Would you mind if we met you in the main conference center?"
"Of course not," Tom said, glancing at Train with questioning eyes to see if it was okay. He simply smiled and nodded his head as a sign of approval. Tom headed for the door, a little off balance because of the slightly unusual turn this day had taken. As he went through the door, he noticed Train had not followed him. Going back, Tom saw him kneeling in front of his chair. Peacefully, quietly, as a submissive child, he had chosen to talk to his father first.
"Father, it seems you have made an appointment for us. We surrender to your perfect will. Let them see you and your son Jesus. We now choose to move and say only what you choose. Thank you for everything. Train."
"I'm ready now," he said, rising to his full height.
"Just need to say thanks for what we are about to see. Father's awesome, isn't he?"
Train said as they opened the door to the conference room. "Yeah, awesome," Tom thought, discovering that maybe he didn't know his father as well as he thought. When he entered the conference center, which was a small theater with a raised platform used by speakers at seminars, it was teeming with people. All 350 seats were filled. People were sitting on the floor in front of the seats, and the aisles were beginning to fill up as more businessmen and women, staff, and some passers-by flowed in. Tom had to laugh to himself as he thought of the animals as they were drawn by the Lord himself into the ark. Foreign to their natural patterns, they humbly obeyed. Now, another group of obedient wanderers quietly submitted, some of them not even knowing why.
"I am once more in awe of our Father in heaven," Train began as he refused the podium or chair on stage, but sat as a child would on the edge of the platform. "Last night, when I started to walk to meet Preacher Man over there," he said, pointing to Tom, who was somewhat embarrassed that few even knew he had given his life to serve Jesus, "my Lord told me to expect him to be with me and not to be surprised by what he was about to do. All night, as I was walking here, he kept telling me about lost sheep that don't know they're lost. I didn't understand until now what he meant."
Tom reminded of what it must have been like when Saul of Tarsus, now Paul, would tell of his life to those gathered in the local communities. Now the Spirit of the living God must have fallen to nullify the objections, the doubts, the false wisdom of the learned. For at the throne of God and his presence there is no special elite, no rank because of money or talent or status esteemed by men. There we all become equal, sinners silent before a holy God. Tom's thoughts turned back to the conference room where people were representing every conceivable walk of life, every circumstance caused by sin, were bathed in the love of the Father. As in the days of Paul, they were becoming enraptured by the story of the life of a wayward lamb that found its way home through the loving shepherd of our souls, Jesus Christ. Train was born in a back alley room, which was used as a shoot-up room by heroin addicts. His mother was a user and sold herself to maintain her need. Ears strained to listen and broad shoulders slumped as he told of nights in the same bed with her as quote-unquote uncles would come to use her. At times he would hide his head in his pillow to make it go away, and even as a small child he would try to defend her from the beatings by those men, only to be beaten himself. Once it was too late and he was not strong enough. All night he tried to wake his mama. He washed the blood from her face and tried to make her hurt go away. Early that morning he was pulled from her mother by another quote-unquote uncle and thrown out in the hall. "Never come back here, kid," he remembered hearing. "Your ma ain't never coming back, so get lost."
Silence, except for an occasional nose blowing or quiet sob, permeated the room as Train told of his life on the street from the age of 5. Survival was the only way of life he knew, and being tougher than the street itself was the only way to make it. Hours flew by as a story of rage, hostility, gang warfare, theft, and crime, heinous enough to defy any imagination, unfolded before the wide-eyed audience of quote-unquote straights. As they were brought through the events that took them to the night Tom met him. "I was on my way to settle a score with the Kings," Train said as he stood for the first time, seeming to again breathe in the new life he found in Jesus. Almost refreshed now and recovered from the relating the life of darkness, he continued. "They had taken out my friend Booney, and I was on my way to take them out. I didn't know it was a setup. They were waiting for me and were going to blow me away too. On my way there, I saw this guy," he said again, pointing in Tom's direction. "He looked out of place on the street, but something made me stand at the corner of a building in the shadows and listen to him. He was talking to these two guys on a bench about this guy who had let a bunch of people take him out by hanging him on a cross. But he asked his father to forgive them. Something inside of me told me to follow him to find out more. That's when Steely, Mick, and Tony tried to kill him." Tom was quieted in his heart for the first time in many months, as Tom related to the crowd the new life he felt coming to him, as he was washed by the blood of the Lamb that night. Just like Saul in the Bible, Train was taken aside by his new Lord and taught from his own mouth. For 8 months, Train received as the Lord of the universe gave. Forgiveness, healing, love, and freedom replaced the grimy sin of the street in this special child. The verse, "He who has been forgiven much loves much," became a reality to Tom as he heard and saw and remembered once more the covenant promise fulfilled in the tabernacle of the living God that stood before the awestruck crowd. "He wants to help you, too. You ain't no different to him. He wants to show you his love, too. All you got to do is take it." With that, he began to pray. Simply, honestly, and naturally, he invited anyone who desired to pray with him. And many did. The miracle of new life became a reality to Judy, who tried to find love with every man she met, and Dick, the office quote-unquote wolf and ridiculer of everyone. Even Mr. Henderson, or Carlyle, as he was now known to Tom, was found on his knees again in the back corner of the platform behind the curtain, along with his newfound lord. To say the least, it was an unusual day at the Henderson architectural firm. How could Tom have known that the biggest surprises were still to come? From our Father's heart. I call you to holiness, but you are too busy to spend time with me. I call you to a crucified life, but you cannot die to yourself. I call you to present my Son to those who are dead, that they might receive his life, but you curse them in my presence. Can you not see how cold you really are? Can you not see how far you've strayed from my purposes for your life? Who are you saving by your actions? What are the purposes of your comings and goings? Whose agenda are you following, and what is its end? Wake up, the harvest is white, and the workers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest. What are his purposes? What is his agenda? Pray for wisdom that you might see with his eyes and move with his heart. The time is short, and much is to be done. Chapter 4. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, and that the excellency of the power may be of God, and not of us. 2 Corinthians 4:7. The new BMW had seemed so important to Tom that morning was somewhat out of place in the light of the purity of what had happened throughout the day. With the front seats more than filled with the two men, Tom and Train made their way to Sally and the kids, who were waiting at Tom's home.
Tom had called first to prepare his family for the grinning mountain by his side. Sally immediately insisted on having Train stay for at least a couple of days, and Tom agreed, thinking it would be good for Train also. Fresh air, good food, and a comfortable bed would be a welcome change to someone who lives like he does, they reasoned. Even after the countless stories Tom had told about him, Sally was not prepared to meet Train. Obviously taken back, she still greeted him enthusiastically, but gave Tom shocked glances when she knew Train wouldn't notice. As he unfolded himself from the front seat of the car and ducked his head on his way through the front door to become the main object in every room he occupied, Train had finally arrived. Now Sally, Tommy, and Becky could see for themselves what Tom had been trying to explain all these months. As a family, the Brackens vacationed with Train in their home on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Events such as those that happened recently at Henderson's seemed to be everyday occurrences in the life of this surrendered vessel of God. Simple walks became spiritual journeys as the Lord led the hurting, the, quote, empty in the lap of luxury, unquote, and the, quote, unquote, hardened by life, to his trusted child who was always available and obedient to share new life. Tom laughed out loud often as the children, so many children, found Train willing to be their quote-unquote mobile climbing tree. They en masse would hang from every accessible handhold and literally crawl to the top of him until he would feign weakness and gently fall to the ground, to the delight of the giggling horde. Once Train was on the ground, they would swarm after him until they were exhausted with joy from the tickling, struggling, and just plain foolishness. Timmy Carlson, a boy who'd never said a word in his 7 years, exclaimed to his parents Wednesday evening after a day of romping and storytelling by Train, "Jesus loves me," pointing to his chest. It seems that the Lord broke through years of being considered less important than work, travel, or things, and filled his heart and opened his mouth. All day Thursday, to anyone who had listened, Timmy was a waterfall of stories and expressions that he had saved all of his short life. Margaret Miller took the brace off of her small, twisted leg to crawl around on the ground. In the spirit of the afternoon and in the heat of the chase, she ran, jumped, and scurried. Only after the roar of life quieted to a normal din, for children, did Fred Smithers yell, "Hey, Margaret, your leg ain't funny no more." In the midst of a stride, Margaret stopped, looked down, and said, "Wow, Jesus must have touched it." He had, and everyone cried. Each encounter seemed to give Train new life or somehow impart to him the joy he had missed himself as a child. He played as he loved and as he prayed, in absolute fullness, total abandon, and childlike endeavor. There was no reason other than God's reason, no encounter other than God's appointment, no situation other than God's desire to show himself to those involved. As far as Train was concerned, D.L. Moody once said that he wondered what would happen in the life of someone totally sold out and surrendered to God. The Brackens were beginning to get a glimpse of what could happen. In 3 days, neighbors, some whom Tom and Sally had never seen, became friends. Cold relationships were warmed, and all were pointed to the sustainer of life and healer of their souls. Old Mrs. Grishaw smiled for the first time after meeting Train and his Lord. Many neighbors who had encountered her wrath for not mowing their lawns right or cutting shrubs too short or picking flowers too early and not in full bloom were startled the first time she smiled. Mickey Tornett, much to the embarrassment of all, pulled his mommy's dress as she was walking to Mrs. Grimshaw and loudly screamed, "I didn't even know she had any teeth." Tom, Sally, Tommy, and Becky were enraptured by their guests. Although Train remained quiet unless he was asked a direct question, there was never a hint of tension or uneasiness. Over the 3 days that Train was with him, an unquestionable friendship, no more than that, an alliance was made that defied human reason. The simple love, the holy peace that permeated this man of God left no room for formality or decorum. It seemed that Train was family in a very new sense of the word to the Brackens. Even Tommy and Becky talked of, quote-unquote, making a part of their new house for Train to live in forever. But Tom and Sally somehow knew that that could not happen. The ride to the Thursday night church service was uneventful, at least in light of the newness of life that had been found over the last few days. One stop at a stoplight to bring a young boy with purple hair to the Lord, an event that would have been enough for at least a few weeks of marveling at any other time,
was the only circumstance of note. Upon arrival at His Holiness Christian Fellowship, an architectural marvel given much press for its beauty and awe-inspiring design, things took an unexpected turn. For the first time since their initial encounter, Tom noticed that Train was somewhat uneasy. An unusual gloom seemed to come over him. Downcast, even morose, he sat and watched as the expensive, shiny luxury automobiles parked and presented their proud, colorful cargo to those who had arrived before them. "I'm gonna sit here for a while," Train stated flatly. "You just go in by yourselves. I'll come in after I talk with my father for a while." "Honey," Tom said to Sally as they walked toward the front door, "I never even noticed that he was wearing the same clothes that he had on when he came. Do you think he's embarrassed about how he looks? I could kick myself for not being more sensitive. Lord, please forgive me." "In the name of the Lord, you say. You go about your business doing your works and call them mine. How can what you do be truly mine if you don't spend enough time with me to hear me, to search my heart, to find my ways, to know me? I am not in your feasts. I am not in your programs. I am not in your fellowships. A time is coming when those who think they hear my voice will see and understand who they have really been listening to. It is not me. All the works of the flesh will wash away as so much grime. I will not complete what I did not initiate. Stop praying for things. Stop working for men and their desires. Begin praying to search me out. I can be found. I desire to be found. Those who choose to know me are wise. Those who come to me will walk the straight, safe path. My ways are sure. My time is well spent for those who have heard me." Chapter 5. For as much as this people draw near me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but remove their hearts and minds far from me, and their fear and reverence for me are a commandment of men that is learned by repetition, without any thought as to the meaning. Therefore, behold, I will again do marvelous things with this people, marvelous and astonishing things, and the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the understanding of the discerning men will vanish or be hidden. Isaiah 29:13 through 14. Heralding itself as quote-unquote one of the fastest growing churches in the land, His Holiness Christian Fellowship took much pride in its impact upon the community it served. From the long, winding entrance sidewalks, past majestic fountains and manicured lawns to the three-balconied superstructure with its orchestra pit and tiered choir platform that was filled as usual to capacity with a 350-member choir, which spoke of the commitment of its congregation to receive the blessings God had for them. Each Sunday, 10 buses would go to the local communities and return with the poor, the infirm, the children who could not make it to His Holiness for some reason or another, and then return them at home after the service. Because of the commitment of Pastor Wickham to be, quote-unquote, salt and light to the world, the activities of the church body were unparalleled. Due to its vast financial resources and the commitment of its people, His Holiness had a powerful influence within its vast outreach arms. 3 abortion clinics could no longer stand under the pressure applied by the church and its connections. In fact, the slogan, quote-unquote, a clinic a week for a year, boldly stated the commitment of the body of believers to, quote-unquote, clean up their community once and for all. In short, much social involvement and its immediate and long-term impact served notice to anyone who attempted to defile the community in which they functioned, that the church was truly a force with which to be reckoned. Thursday evening service at His Holiness Christian Fellowship was a time of testimony, praise, and Bible study. Mrs. Fontaine testified of her inheritance coming through after a long and drawn-out court battle. Tom Dilling thanked God for his new job, and Mike and Cindy Lackinger praised God for their new mortgage. They felt it must have been God's hand on them, for they really didn't qualify for a mortgage that size, but somehow they got it anyway. Tom and Millie led the gathering in praise that seemed unusually sweet, at least to Tom and Sally, and prayer was offered for the sick and the lonely. All in all, it was a good evening. Pastor Wickham spoke of laying down our lives to become more like Jesus, and people came forward to commit to doing that. In fact, it seemed that they were the same people who usually came forward. Pastor noticed that Train, who had slipped in sometime during the service, was sitting in the last row, under the first tier of balcony seats. "I'm sure by now you all have heard about this man," Pastor stated, extending his arm in a gesture of welcome toward Train. "He has caused quite a stir around here and is gaining a reputation for himself," he continued. "Train, would you come forward and share with us what the Lord is laying on your heart?" Pastor called with a warm smile. All eyes turned toward the person whose name had been on the lips of many, with stories that sometimes even surpassed the immense impact that they in themselves had. Slowly, Train stood to his feet. His countenance seemed heavy. Gone was his characteristic smile and the brightness it invoked. As he lifted his head, Tom saw that tears had filled his eyes. For a moment, Train surveyed the church body, which was now also sensing that something was not in order. He gazed upon all that were there with Christ-like compassion. Then, in quiet reverence, he turned and slowly walked out the door. I'd better go and see what's up," Tom said to Sally. "Try to find a ride home, okay? I might be late." Tom left the startled crowd behind, almost running as he passed faces expressing wonderment and questioning what had just transpired. He leaped down the front steps and slid past the startled group of teens, who tried to quickly conceal the one cigarette they were sharing in secret. Tom asked a pimply-faced boy 14 years of age who was attempting to give the cigarette to anyone who would take it, "Have you seen a really big guy come past here?" "Yeah." "He scared the pants off us," Billy Cameron said, waving his hand around in a vain attempt to remove the cloud of smoke that encircled all of them. "We thought he was an angel or something, he was so big. I think he's over there behind that garage." Running in the direction Billy had pointed, Tom began to pray. "Lord, help me to help him. I'm sorry if I've hurt him. How could I know all this would be too much for him?" Then at the corner of the Family Resources building, Tom saw him, sobbing like a little baby. His immense frame jolted with each new burst of tears. He was bent over a yard tractor in weakness from the pain. "I'm sorry." "Man," Tom said, "is there anything I can do?" "I need to go home," was Train's response through continued tear bursts that defied his rugged features. I want you to come with me," he stated in a tone that left no room for discussion. The sun had set over the well-lit street lamps, sculptured lawns and expensive homes, filled with all the finery money could buy. Now the darkness had again encapsulated the dingy corners, grimy alleys, and stark homes that had given up on trying to overcome their age and hopeless surroundings. As Tom drove deeper into the home of the cancer-infested society with its gangs on every corner waiting for who knows what, that he has acts done in dark places, the hopeless attempting to find hope, he silently prayed for the Lord to protect him, hold him, and help him to understand what was happening. The shiny new and now in this setting ridiculous-looking BMW pulled to a stop in front of a building that looked as if it had been abandoned for years. Tom realized that he was very near to the place where he'd first met Train. As soon as the car stopped, Train disembarked and stretched to relieve his cramped muscles. He stood silently near the right front fender of Tom's car as a crowd started to gather. Tom was amazed at the number of people who came from nowhere to look at him, his car, and just to be there for whatever would happen next. As the crowd got bigger and closer, Tom felt the best place to be was nearer to Train as possible. As he attempted to move in that direction, something happened that he had never experienced before. Even though he tried to excuse himself to get to Train, no one would move. In fact, no one would look directly at him. He remembered the open defiance he had met with the two young boys playing ball the night he met Train, but that was nowhere near as frightening as this. The common courtesies that were a part of Tom's normal life did not exist for him there, and it made him frightened beyond belief. What chance did he have if anything dangerous happened? What would he say if anyone even spoke to him? He was truly the oddball with his expensive car and clothes, and instantly he wished he were not so different. He knew he didn't belong here and was sure that everyone was purposely letting that be evident to him. It was almost as if the strongest mass became the quote-unquote owner
of any given event. Showing that you are able to maintain control gives you control. Sometimes that might be a gang, some loud gesture, or simple street toughness, depending on the situation. As Tom watched, pockets of forces began to form, making elementary attempts at being noticed. A gang of youths began pushing each other. Some girls began to giggle loudly and jitterbug to imaginary music. Several larger men moved near the car and began appraising it as if they were potential buyers. As Tom was preoccupied with the people in his immediate surroundings, he had noticed the subtle change that had taken place. From the moment Train had moved to the front fender of the car, he began to pray silently. His father, knowing his need at that specific moment, using the means available, equipped Train with street authority. Everyone knew that he had sold out to Jesus, that he also fought no more, and that he wasn't the same as he had been a year ago. But still, a spirit more powerful than his former spirit embodied him. No matter what anyone else may have had in mind to do, God's will would be done. Tom saw it in his face. His countenance had changed from morose to determined right before Tom's eyes. Everyone else noticed it as soon as he spoke. "Let it be known on the street," he said in a voice Tom remembered hearing only once before at their first meeting, "that this is my friend's car. Do you understand?" he said with added directness. They did. The crowd immediately quieted and began to disperse. Train took the most unlikely candidates, the quote-unquote appraisers, and called them aside. "I need you guys to make sure nothing happens to that car. You're going to do that." He spoke in surprising gentleness. "Yes, sir," they agreed in unison, most like a child, almost childlike. Train thanked them and expressed in street talk how confident he was that the car would be safe. As Tom and Train walked toward the building where Train lived, he could hear the men making plans and discussing who might do the best job protecting the car and which shifts they should take through the night. Tom didn't understand why he knew his car would be all right, but he did. Tom's reasons were justified, for silently, in addition to the men, several invisible warriors positioned themselves near the car and around the entrances of the building before them.